think we're ready. First of all, I want to welcome you all to the 62nd Annual Joint North Dakota Water Convention. My name is Harold Gogler, and I'm the president of the North Dakota Water Resources Association. And before I get started, I wanted to mention to you that in order to receive credit as managers for the training, you need to fill out the manager's training questionnaire and get that sent back to the ladies in the registration desk upstairs. So if you want to get credit for it, fill it out and get it back to the girls. And the other thing in the middle of this packet is a water survey. So if you fill that out, please, and get it back to the registration desk also, there'll be somebody drawn out of the group that fills it out for a free convention registration for next year. With that, I want to recognize the sponsors for this year. As the water champions, we have AE2S, Ackerman Estvold, Houston Engineering, Moore Engineering, the North Dakota Department of Water Resources. Under the Water Partner Group, we have the Apex Engineering Group, Bar Engineering, Bartlett and West, Black and Veatch, Bismarck-Mandan Convention and Visitors Bureau, Devils Lake Basin Joint Water Resource Board, Ohnstad Twichell, and under the Water Supporter Group, we have Chevron, HDR, North Dakota Insurance Reserve Fund, North Dakota Rural Water Systems Association, Vogel Law Firm, and under the Friends of Water, we have Ag Country Farm Credit Services and Farm Credit Service of Mandan, Karsten Construction Incorporated, Dakota Supply Group, Minnesota Valley Irrigation in Bismarck. And then for those of you that can't see very well, this isn't a Lutheran church and you don't have to sit in the back. So if you want to move to the front, this would be a good opportunity to do that. And if you can't hear, move a little closer too. So this morning we have our first presentation is based on something that happened this time last year. The Supreme Court ruled on a case dealing with the city of Grand Forks that changes the way we look at the assessment, cost, and benefit assessment projects. In response, the Water Resource Districts Association put together a work group to develop some guidance for the water resource districts on this topic. And our first presenter this morning is from that working group. Please welcome Zack Hermann.
All right, well, thank you. Just to introduce myself for those of you that maybe haven't met me before, but as Harold mentioned, my name is Zack Hermann. I'm with Houston Engineering. I've been with the firm for about closing in on 20 years here. Most of that experience has been related to sort of rural water management, ag drainage in eastern North Dakota and western Minnesota. Very kind of indicative of a lot of the drainage projects that we deal with in the state of North Dakota. So what I'm going to give you guys an update on is the working group that's been sort of ongoing for the past year or so to establish a framework to determine a benefit amount on a per parcel basis as required by the Supreme Court ruling. Kind of just a real rough outline of what we'll go through here. Just some background. Sean Fredericks couldn't be here with us today because of the weather, but he I'll attempt to give a little bit of background in terms of why this came about and why this is needed. We'll go through the purpose of the committee, some considerations and assumptions that were contemplated by the committee, a review of the methodology that we're sort of working through right now, an example drainage system, and then some takeaways that we've had as we've gone through the process. So first off, I guess before we get into the purpose, just the background. Harold mentioned this at the beginning, but about a year ago at this time, there was a Supreme Court ruling that stated to assess costs for a project, you must first determine what the benefit is received on the parcel that is receiving the assessment. What that essentially did was, rather than sort of apportioning costs as a surrogate to benefit through the voting process, we then had to go through and determine what is the total benefit received by it, and ensure that the benefit exceeds the proposed assessment for the project. So again, the purpose is to satisfy that court ruling. The benefits as it relates to apportioning costs for assessment projects. So we're trying to get to what's the total benefit amount that can then be used to help inform water resource districts on how costs should be apportioned. We really want to satisfy the water resource district requirements for determining the per benefit parcel, or the per benefit parcel amount, or per parcel benefit amount, excuse me, that's required. And again, I just want to highlight at the bottom here that this is an advisory capacity. This is not something that's dictated as a process that must be followed under any type of law or rule. This is something that's being put out there as sort of like a best practices guidance document to assist water resource districts as they navigate through the assessment projects on their projects. So, we're really kind of, what we're going to talk about today is going to be more agricultural focused. A lot of the projects that these assessment projects that water resource districts undertake are in a rural ag setting. Their purpose is to provide increased agricultural production to the land that it benefits. So our focus today is to discuss a method to determine what those agricultural benefits could be for those assessment projects. So first thing that was kind of had to be considered by the committee is establishing what is the baseline. So if you think of benefit, you're essentially measuring what's your return without the project and what's your return with the project. So we have to establish what that baseline level is in order to get that sort of comparison to determine what the benefit is. The committee kind of talked about this in terms of how this should be looked at in terms of a project. It's not clear in Century Code. They just refer to the project. So, a lot of our systems throughout the state of North Dakota have been established for many years, some over 100 years. And the projects themselves, or the actions that are undertaken by the water resource districts, really are sort of a maintenance or preservation of benefit for the overall system. So establishing what that baseline was important, and ultimately the process we're looking at would actually look at the baseline being, what is the condition of the benefited lands without drainage in place, and what's the condition with the project in place. So we're not looking at the benefit in terms of what's the benefit of a small incremental action that may be proposed by the water resource district, but more so, what's the benefit that is provided by the system as a whole. So that's how we're looking at benefit. That's how the baseline comparison was looked at. The other thing that we kind of have to we had to contemplate was, what's the difference between direct and indirect benefits. So that is called out in Century Code in terms of eligible benefits for differing benefiting parties. While it's called out, there's not a statutory definition of direct versus indirect. So we kind of went through and tried to establish what's the line between those two. So I've got a few examples of direct benefits versus indirect benefits. So on the direct benefit side, from an agricultural productivity standpoint, this isn't a comprehensive list. This is just sort of examples of things that could be agricultural productivity. So, increased production, obviously. So by having drainage, being able to better manage surface water, we see increased yields. Better management of subsurface drainage can help with salinity conditions within the soil. Another thing that a lot of these drainage systems actually had facilitated years ago is intensification of areas. So, there's a lot of areas that maybe were were too wet to put in a higher value crop because drainage was added to the landscape. Now they're in production of high value row crop, maybe beets, potatoes, that type of thing. So just some examples. Again, every project is unique. We can't make a system that fits every single project. So as we go through this methodology, for the specific benefits that your project may receive, the methodology allows a flexibility for the water resource district to contemplate what are the specific benefits that a project receives. So, in certain parts of the state, irrigation is a big thing. So if we have drainage and ability to manage water, is there any impact on how that impacts those type of variables as well? Again, the framework is not intended to be a black box to give you to sort of shove in some inputs and get an answer. It's more a method to look at critically and determine what are the specific direct benefits that your project applies. Indirect benefits, so just some examples of those. So one thing to note with indirect benefits, per the Century Code, indirect benefits are not eligible to be placed on a specific parcel. So indirect benefits, in general, you can think of them as sort of what are the things that are provided societally as a whole. So establishment of a governance system, really hard to monetize that and put that dollar amount onto a specific parcel, but by having a drainage system in place, there are maybe better management of the drainage within that benefited area. Again, sort of an indirect benefit, hard to quantify what specifically that is. Things like water quality, improving nutrient loading downstream, unless there's a direct correlation to reduce treatment costs at some downstream water intake plant or something. It's really hard to put a dollar amount on how much that benefits society as a whole. But those are things that, depending on the practices for specific projects, can be benefits that are provided, really hard to monetize and aren't included in this analysis, and in fact aren't allowed to be included as the benefit on a specific parcel or lot. So just to get into the background of the method that we'll be talking about. So, when we started out on this process, we first started out by taking a look at what have other states done that have similar drainage. And really one of the only other states that has drainage on the scale that we see, particularly in the eastern third of North Dakota, is western Minnesota. They have an established drainage code and drainage law similar to we do. And we kind of looked at things that had been done in that state, not saying that we were mimicking the process there, but just looking at how did they contemplate benefits when they were determining that for a project. Then we also kind of dug into, something that we have in North Dakota that's fairly unique is we actually have a mandated process for determining the taxation value of agricultural property in the state. So essentially the Century Code defines taxable value of agricultural property as the capitalized average annual return over a 10-year period. What that means is that through the North Dakota State Tax Commissioner's Office, they actually work with NDSU to develop values for soil based on productivity, things like that. Counties can, work with the tax commissioner on modifiers for things like frequently flooding and that type of thing. I'm sure some of you in the crowd that have agricultural property maybe are well versed in that process. But essentially, what that does is arrives at a true and full value that is used for determining what taxes are on that particular parcel, and it all relates back to the anticipated monetary capitalized return off of that parcel. So we started with that process. We'll kind of get into how we use that. But just before we get into that, again, just kind of to go through the process in high level, we'll go through some examples, but we're essentially working backwards from the process that the tax commissioner and NDSU use to get to the true market value, to get to what the average annual return is, and then estimate what the uplift potential is as a result of a drainage project. So that's the general process that we're looking at a really high level. We can make these slides available if you want to read through in more detail after the presentation, but I do want to get moving to just through some examples that we have. So I always like a few graphics. Hopefully this makes hearing an engineer talk about economics a little less painful for you at 8 a.m. in the morning, but I think this helps illustrate what we're trying to accomplish here. So if we look at, say, a parcel of land, say a quarter of land that's in agricultural production, the annual earning potential off of that land, whoops, the annual earning potential is essentially what do you get for crop off of it. So, my nice little graphic there of corn times the rate times the dollar amount per bushel essentially is your annual earning potential. So, but we know there's more to it than that, right? Like as you grow a crop, you have input costs. You have to plant the crop, you have to maintain the crop, you have to fertilize, herbicide, all that type of thing that happens through the growing season. You have to harvest it, you have to get it to market. All those type of things come into play. So what we defined as sort of the annual gross return is what's the return after our input costs are applied. And that's what you see there. So the yellow represents those input costs that the landowner has to take just to get the crop to market essentially. So when we're contemplating after a project's in place, what we're really trying to estimate is, you see, we had kind of the pre-project return. Obviously, a drainage project, the goal is to see a net increase. So we see increase in the productivity of the land, and then that correlates to what the uplift potential is that you see there. And again, sort of the same line, we have increased landowner costs. One thing we contemplated as we went through this is those costs do not increase linearly as you have increased yields. So if you can envision, if you're going to plant, if we keep things simple, and let's say we have land that's frequently flooded that's in corn production. If we keep it as corn production and it's less frequently flooded, we are going to have some increased costs to get that crop to market. We maybe have additional trucks because of the increased bushels coming off the property. We may have increased, dealing with herbicides and fertilizing and that type of thing. But it's not linear because, a lot of the upfront costs are going to be fixed. Like to plant the crop is going to cost what it's going to cost to plant the crop on that quarter, essentially. So we're attempting to estimate what's that marginal increase in cost by having that increased production on the land. I should state as we go through this, being an engineer, I like to work in the world of black and white, but the reality is with economics is we're really trying to establish what we think is the least shade of wrong, if you will. There's so many variables that come into estimating what the benefit is of a project. We're just trying to do what we think is reasonable to establish a baseline and then look at the project under those same set of variables to estimate what a benefit amount could be. So I do want to highlight that. I'm sure there's some people maybe looking at some of this thinking, well, how do you estimate that? There's so many things that happen on my specific farm throughout the year. How are you supposed to predict that through a mathematical equation? But again, we're just trying to come up with a reasonable baseline based on reasonable assumptions, and then use those same, kind of hold those variables the same to say, well, this is what would have happened if the project were in place. So when we talk about a specific project, so let's say, let's go back a slide. So let's say we're talking about a large drainage project, right? So, and let's say that the post-project parcel that we're looking at here is a project that's 3 miles from the drain, right? So just by having drainage in place, they see this uplift potential. But then we also have to account that there's a cost that a landowner has to undertake in most instances to realize the true benefit of that project, right? So not every parcel is located directly adjacent to the drain, say midway up the drain alignment where they drain directly into the channel. And that's another thing that we contemplated was, we call it hydrologic reductions, but that parcel, if it's 3 miles away from the drain, there's going to be some level of cost on that landowner to realize the benefit, right? Like there maybe is an improvement to a township road ditch to get the water to that location. There's maybe a culvert that has to be upsized to put it at a certain location. So those are what those reduction factors are. We attempted to apply that. We'll get into some examples of what that looks like. Again, I just wanted to show this. I think this graphic sort of helps with what we're trying to do. And ultimately, what we want to get to is, if we compare those two green bars, that's the benefit that the parcel receives as a result of the project. So at a high conceptual level, that's what we're trying to get at in terms of what the benefit is that's received from a project. So just to give an example, this is fictitious drain, say drain 1 in XY County. Again, I'm not going to go through all the verbiage on the text, but if what you're looking at here is the squiggly blue line correlates to like the river outlet. The dash blue line would be the drain alignment, and all the white boxes would be parcels that are in the benefit area. Again, simplistic way of looking at it. We'll get into sort of a real world example where we push this through an actual drainage project to show what that looks like. But to help maybe reinforce what we're doing, I want to walk through this more simplistic example. So first things, each parcel has some type of land use to it, right? So let's say majority of the land in this fictitious drainage assessment area is in agricultural production. There's varying crops, there's varying rotations, but we do have one area in here that's largely wildlife. And I think this is, we see this all throughout the state. Just, I don't know, pretend this is U.S. Fish and Wildlife land, tax exempt land, right? So that piece is in there as well. So essentially what we're trying to do to get to what remember that annual gross return, you see the equation on the bottom there, but essentially we're using the exact same process that we're just sort of using the equation backwards and solving for the annual gross return to get to what we think the annual gross return is on a per parcel basis. So, essentially what that is true and full value times the capitalization rate. And that's another figure that's published annually by the state tax commissioner, and dividing that by the percentage landowner share. We'll get into kind of takeaways, but as we went through example projects, we actually did one hands-on with a water resource district. I would say something that we were anticipating but was reinforced through that process is throughout this process, the level of the amount of input of local understanding of specific things that happen in that project area is critical to understanding what the benefits are. Again, this gets back to there's no such thing as a perfect black box economics tool. Everything has, even at a township level, there may be things that are different, say on the west half of a township versus the east half. And having knowledge of what those things are in the system certainly helps. So there was a lot of input. There was a lot of dialogue back and forth to make sure that parameters were reflective of what was typical for that specific area. But essentially what we're trying to get to is you see what's on the screen. The darker green correlates to higher gross return potential than the lighter greens. Sort of moving on, then the next step is once we have that annual gross return, we have to figure out what's the uplift potential. Or again, if we go back to the bar charts, what's the opportunity for the yield to increase, which is going to correlate into increased revenue off of that parcel. So there's a couple things that we looked at. The examples in the bar charts were pretty conceptual and straightforward that I talked through with the cornfield example. But again, the reality is we have other things that happen on the landscape. We have a lot of land that prior to drainage being in place, maybe would have been in some type of summer fallow, small grain rotation because of frequent flooding, high salinity, those type of things. Now, because of drainage being in place, that may have facilitated to more of a row crop production, or potentially even maybe that land is in some type of specialty crop now as well. So we're trying to estimate what's the intensification, or what we call, when cropland conversion, or what is the intensification plus the potential yield increase to get to the annual gross return. And again, this gets a little bit convoluted when we look at existing systems, because we're attempting to quantify what's the benefit that system is providing as a whole. So we're actually almost taking a look backwards from where it is right now. Like a lot of those lands are already receiving those benefits. So we're trying to hypothetically say, what happens if the system wasn't in place? What do we think the benefit is that's currently being received by that land? So again, it's not just as simple as our costs stay fixed and the yield increases and we get this larger return off of the land. The reality is as the yield increases, we have some level of marginal cost increase. I have highlighted there just a couple pictures for illustration, but it can be additional trucks to get the crop off. Obviously, if you go from 100 bushel an acre corn to 200 bushel an acre corn, it's going to take a lot more effort to get that crop to market come harvest. So just a couple examples there in terms of what those increases in marginal costs are when we're talking about that. And then, like I said, there's this whole concept of hydrologic factors. So I'm going to highlight two examples. There are two examples, at least in my experience, have come up quite a bit when we're contemplating assessments. The first one is the example, you see it on the far, that direction on the screen, the smaller, say it's a quarter of land that's highlighted there. They have an uplift potential, but the reality is, again, they've got 1.5 miles to get the water to the system, and they're going to have to take on additional costs to get that water to the system. So the other example that we hear quite a bit is folks that are situated near the outlet of the drain. They maybe have some immediate benefit by getting water into the drain, but then they also end up sitting, well, what they quote unquote sitting with the water from the rest of the assessment area to drain through the system before all the rest of their water can fully drain off. So those are two examples that we hear quite a bit. Probably more so on the eastern tier and Red River Valley flat topography where it's slow to drain near the outlet a lot of times. But those are a couple examples in terms of the reduction factors that were contemplated. I'll get into maybe how we applied that in an example system coming up here. But again, the purpose of this method is to allow some professional judgment and input from the local water resource district, landowners, reference to applicable maybe academic publications, that type of thing, to allow the water resource district to make the determination on what's appropriate for how these reduction factors are applied for a specific situation. Like I mentioned, it's really hard to come up with a black box model or tool, if you will, that contemplates benefit appropriately, say in Pembina County and say in Williams County. They're just two very different animals, and there needs to be some ability for the user to make those judgments. So this shows maybe an example reduction factor. So dark green to light green. The dark green has a lower reduction factor, all the way to the light greens, which have a higher reduction factor. Again, I'll get into an example of how we applied that in an example system coming up here. But the intent is to have some flexibility so water resource districts can have the ability to make that judgment specific to their unique circumstances. And there's other things that can come into this as well. There might be, depending on where you are in the state, wetland easements may prevent drainage across a parcel and that type of things. And those are the type of things, again, specific to each project, but can be contemplated by the water resource district on how that should be applied to benefit. So ultimately, what we're trying to do, again, another nice graphic here, so you don't have to listen to an engineer, look at charts and bullets all morning here. But what we're trying to do is we're taking those two things and we're overlaying them. And that essentially is how we come up with the benefit. So we first come up with, I'll go back to that. So we first come up with, on the left side of the slide, we first come up with what do we think the annual uplift potential is off of that parcel, or what's the difference in the two green bars, if you remember that from the bar chart example. And then if we reduce that based on proximity, whatever the case may be, and we overlay those two, again, ultimately our goal is to get to what's the annual benefit that's received on a parcel by parcel basis. So I won't get into the details of this, but in terms of measuring project benefit, and I think this is consistent with the methodology with the DWR's economic analysis tool, is once that benefit is applied on a parcel by parcel basis, that's an annual return benefit. That's then amortized out for the projected project life. So then that's how you get to the total benefit received by the project. So as an example, annually, the Corps of Engineers publishes their annual discount rate that's used on water resource projects across the country to essentially amortize out costs for a project life. And then as an example, say a larger capital improvement project, say a 50-year design life, also assuming maybe some level of maintenance happens on an annual basis as well. So I'm going to get into an example system. This is all real data. This is an example drainage system that we ran through the process on. This is actually a project that's being contemplated by the Water Resource District currently. But I just wanted to show you maybe how we applied this. So where we are, this is the eastern tier of North Dakota. The river that the system is outletting into is the Red River. So this is extremely flat topography, characterized by land that has drainage, is very high production land. A lot of it is in some corn, a lot of wheat, soybean, sugar beet rotation within the area here. We are dealing with some U.S. Fish and Wildlife property and some WRP easements as well in the western portion of the benefit area. And again, we wanted to use this method to sort of walk through the process of what benefit might look like on a per parcel basis. So as we kind of get into it, the data that we used as a basis to make some of these decisions for this watershed was, we first started with, it's called the USDA Surgal Soils Database, but essentially that's the same baseline data that's used by NDSU when they're developing their soil productivity analysis on an annual basis. This, as an example, just shows the CPI index. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the CPI index, that the root of that, when you get that from, say, on a parcel of property, comes from this soil data. So this is just correlating to darker green all the way on to sort of the lighter green, almost white color, dark green being high CPI, all the way down to the light green, which is lower CPI. So in addition to that, there's actually, I don't know the total count, hundreds, if not thousands of other variables that are available from the soils data. A lot of them are derived from some of the measured data when the soil surveys were originally done, but it gives us maybe a high level look at what some of the issues might be with the soil, things related to salinity, things related to ponding, frequently flooding, soil retention capacity, all those type of things that can help us out in determining what we think a benefit would be that's received off of those. So we started by looking at this. We looked at several variables went into it. There was a high focus on salinity. A lot of what drives this system is not only getting surface water off of crops, but is also providing an adequate outlet to sufficiently manage subsurface water because of the salinity concerns in this part of the state. So again, in this example, I think this is true of most counties now, but we did have spatially correct and attributed parcel data. So essentially we had the parcels in GIS mapping format, so we could do this analysis within GIS. This shows the outline of the parcels overlaid on top of the soils data. Another thing we had, there's a whole lot of colors on here. Apologize for not having a legend for this one, but what each color correlates to is a different land use or crop type. So on an annual basis, USDA, they call it NAS, it's National Agricultural Statistics Service. They populate a database across the country to establish what the crop types were on, I believe it's 30-meter gridded data. So for example, the purples, I believe, correlate to beet production. The greens are soybeans, and I believe the yellows are corn, and the lighter kind of peach is wheat. So what this allowed us to do in this case is, because we have this data spatially referenced and we have the parcel data, we can do just some sort of high-level statistics to determine what the cropping rotations are on a parcel-by-parcel basis. That was then sort of validated with coordination with the Water Resource District. And obviously now across the state, we are pretty blessed in the state of North Dakota. We have high-resolution LiDAR data that's available across the state. That was a big part of went into the analysis here. So you see this outlined on a drainage system. The sort of brownish dark red is high all the way on down as you move east to the dark blue, which is low. So that data, what that allowed us to do then is, we're able to take a look at a pretty high level of precision in terms of how water moves across the landscape to get to the drain. And a lot of this is really geared towards coming up with what's those reduction factors. So, if a parcel, I don't have a laser on here, but say a parcel on the west end of the drainage system, we actually know, like, well, how many hydrologic miles does it take for that water to get to the drain? And that lets us contemplate things like what's the cost to access that system? So again, we kind of went through all the variables. We worked with some soil scientist professionals to develop, just looking at those soil variables to develop what's a uplift potential based on various combinations of soil attributes. So I failed to mention, but one thing the soil attributes do allow us to do is they do contemplate drained versus undrained conditions. So there is an ability to kind of assess what is the potential increase, or what is the change in the soil. Then that obviously has to be applied to get to a percentage for a monetary uplift potential. But again, before we get to that part, the first step is on a parcel by parcel basis is to contemplate what do we think the gross return is. And again, this system already has drainage in place. We're looking at doing some larger, maybe extraordinary improvement projects to preserve the benefit that's provided by the system. We're looking at this from an existing condition standpoint. So this is essentially the annual gross return that's expected as it sits today or under the drain condition. This is a little bit different in that when we estimated uplift, we actually took a look backwards to say, well, what if the drain wasn't there? But essentially what we did is, again, we're looking at things like intensification, yield increase, to contemplate those type of things for this specific case. We had the variables that applied to the soils to help inform us on decisions, but then we also tried to look at real world examples on a parcel by parcel basis, sort of as a gut check. What would be an expected crop rotation and yield if the drainage were not in place as compared to what would be the expected crop rotation, or what is the crop rotation and yield now that drainage is in place, and use that to kind of help inform the decision making on the uplift. And again, there's a lot of subjectivity that goes into this. I think any economic analysis, if you really get into the how is the benefit derived, there is a lot of subjectivity. There's a lot of input that goes in with local landowners. I know I've been involved in several federal benefit cost analysis projects. Interviewing landowners is always early and one of the most important pieces to ensure that the data that's being used is accurate. So then, like I mentioned, we get to that gross uplift on a parcel by parcel basis. So dark green is higher uplift, light green is lower. I did mention we have a few parcels. You see the very, very light green parcels in the far west. That's actually U.S. Fish and Wildlife waterfowl production area. So their benefit is essentially zero. They're tax exempt through the process as well. But and then, one thing we also did through this process is we looked at, I believe there was about 3/4 of WRP, all at varying points in the easement, all of it with the intention that it's going to come out and they're going to attempt to farm what they can when that happens. So what we looked at was what's the duration left on those easements. So there was a lot of coordination with the Water Resource District office to get the data we needed from the county. What was the duration left on those easements to sort of discount their proportional benefit for the years that they're not going to realize it until that easement comes out. And then there's the discount. So there were sort of two main factors that we wanted to look at. The first one was the hydrologic proximity. So again, what we did is we took a look at what we thought was a reasonable cost on a per mile basis to improve a drainage system to access the outlet. We then applied it to this flow length that it takes for a parcel to get to the outlet of the drain. In fact, in this case, it's actually it's done on a very, very fine gridded scale that's then sort of aggregated up to the parcel level. So you see, as you'd expect, as you get further away from the drain, those costs increase because it sort of makes sense. The further they have to go, the more the costs are going to be there. One thing maybe to point out here jumped out at me when we first went through this analysis, but you see there's actually one sort of almost dark green parcel that's right adjacent to the drain. And as we dug into the details there's a portion of that parcel, a good portion of it actually, that currently all flows north. So it takes sort of a roundabout way to get to the drain. We contemplated on how to handle that. given the flat topography, it's likely that if they can overcome regulatory challenges, that they'll take that drainage to the south to realize benefit more direct. But that's going to also be an increased cost. So we decided to leave the cost to access sort of concurrent with the existing condition drainage. The next piece that we contemplated for this specific drain is what's the proximity relative to the outlet, and sort of what we're getting at there is what we wanted to look at was, you know, if you're located closer to the outlet of the drain, there's a couple things. Number one, the reality is you're dealing with the accelerated drainage from the rest of the watershed to get past you. So there is that piece of it as well. There's also the piece that if you're located further west in the watershed, you have more of a need for the total infrastructure project than somebody that's situated near the outlet, right? So if you were situated near the outlet and you're looking at only your parcel as a whole, your need is maybe only 3/4 of a mile of that channel, versus if you're all the way near the upstream end, your need is maybe the full 5.5 miles. So we looked at that to try and apply it sort of a reduction factor to the parcels as well on a benefit basis. So ultimately, we overlaid the estimated total uplift just as a result of having adequate water management, and then did these reductions based on the proximity to get to a per parcel benefit amount. You can see the benefits highlighted there. Again, dark green higher, light green lower levels of benefit that's received by those parcels. As I mentioned, there's a lot of subjectivity that went into how this is analyzed and how this is used to perform assessment. I think is still a little bit of a water resource district decision if it's 100% proportional to the benefit, if things are sort of used to develop regions of comparable levels of benefit, recognizing some of the limitations of the analysis. But ultimately, this is what was tasked from the working group, was to get to how do we get to a per parcel benefit charge. So just a few quick takeaways. I've hit on this several times, but this is not an exact science. We're trying to predict essentially the unpredictable. There's a lot of things, as we've seen over the last couple of years, there's a lot of things in the farm market that can change things pretty drastically, right? In terms of what are external commodity prices doing, what are all those type of things doing. But again, we're trying to establish a baseline under reasonable assumptions, hold those assumptions, and then look at what the benefit is that's provided by our project. So hit on this also a few times, but local input is critical through the process. Obviously, we need to be very cognizant of working with professionals to ensure that the perceived benefits and uplifts are rooted in reality. But having that input from both local producers, the water board, all those type of things are really critical to getting to a reasonable answer. As we went through the example, maybe just something to keep in mind as you go through it is you really got to be cognizant of how the county applies soil modifiers. So in the example county we were looking at, soil modifiers, a landowner actually applies to the county for a certain modifier, whether it's salinity or frequent flooding or whatever the case may be. And it's sort of an elective process. The landowner has to initiate it. So you may have parcels out there that would qualify for a modifier, but they don't receive it. So in this process, we had to kind of look at that with a high level of scrutiny. We actually brought things back to the unmodified condition to get to the productivity potential, because we felt that the process we were going through, the discounts were really built in because we were looking at the physical parameters of the soil to determine impacts on productivity. So again, I think I've hit on a lot of these throughout the presentation, but there is no such thing as a one size fits all when it comes to benefits analysis. The benefits process, certainly, but when you talk about like how do you derive what a benefit dollar amount is, every project is going to be unique. I know Cliff Isendorf up in Bottineau County, they're dealing with things that maybe are completely different than what we're dealing with on the eastern tier of the state. And I know drainage projects in, say, prairie pothole country have their own unique set of circumstances. And it's really tough to have something be one all-encompassing tool. But what we attempted to do was to lay out sort of a framework on process that allows for consistency in how these benefits are derived. So there's some uniformity on the process, whether it be in Cass County, say Stutzman County, or someplace to Bowman County. So there's a process that can be followed and replicated, but allows for some input through the Water Resource District to ensure that we're getting to reasonable local answers in terms of what the true benefit is that's provided by the project. And ultimately, this is a method. We've ran through a couple test cases. Myself, I know Kurt Lisney has ran through a couple as well. But it's going to continue to evolve. I think this is something that, as we learn more, it's going to continue to evolve as we find things that maybe can be tweaked. Obviously, that'll be adjusted. So, where we are at in the process is essentially, the methodology has generally been developed. We're putting together just a guidance document that sort of outlines in more detail the technical process to follow the methodology that we've laid out here. Once that's done, that'll be made available through the working group back to the Water Resource District Association. So with that, I can stand for any questions if we have time, or are we taking those at the end? Or otherwise, I'll be around as well all the whole conference if people want to. Sure. Yep. Yeah, so the project cost that's being contemplated right now is about 1.2 million. So 50 years is what we use, 50 years and a 3%. And then the benefit cost on that project was about a 2.5 using this method. And that was assuming the implementation costs along with, I can't recall the number off the top of my head, but we estimated an annual maintenance cost that was also discounted out over the life of the project, recognizing that, I would say every 10 to 15 years, there's a fairly major clean out that happens on a lot of these drains. So. Yeah, certainly. Through this process, I think that would be available through some of those things where I could foresee that. Just an example off the top of my head. Let's say we're dealing with the drainage system in the central part of the state, right? And the landscape is covered in the old U.S. Fish and Wildlife easements that really prevent any type of drainage activity. This method would allow for that data to be incorporated into the analysis to discount, or however you want to look at it, those particular parcels. So, yep. Yeah, so are you contemplating installing rural water infrastructure ahead of annexation? Is that what? Yeah. Yeah, so I will say, through the Water Resource District process, so in your case, you'd have to work with the Water Resource District for the specific authorities that are talked about here. In terms of what's best there, I believe there are collaborative efforts. Maybe Kirk can speak to that more. He's got experience with the Cass County boards, but in terms of collaborative efforts between their boards in land that's already annexed with the city, and what that looks like, I guess I'm not really prepared to speak on that specific issue, but Kurt might be a good person for you to follow up with on that. So yeah. And this is something that this process, when we talk about drainage benefits, this process is something, not just drainage benefits, but any type of assessment that's placed on a parcel. So I know that a lot of cities have been kind of taking on their own approach on how do they determine a benefit. Let's say if they're assessing a cost for a stormwater improvement or something like that. This is kind of more focused on the ag piece, I guess. So, yep. Yeah, yep. Yep, yeah. This method would allow you maybe a defensible method to get to the answer you're looking for. Whether that happens first through, the Water Resource District taking on that role before it becomes sort of the jurisdictional authority of you as a city or not. I can't speak to sort of what would be best in your specific situation, but. All right, thank you.
Well, all right, we will move on to the next presenter. Our next presenter is Katie Schmidt with Ohnstad and Twichell, and they will be presenting on HR best practices for water resource districts. Katie Schmidt was graduate of University of North Dakota School of Law with distinction in 2011. She joined Ohnstad and Twichell in 2015 and concentrates her practice in municipal law, water law, public finance, and employment law. Thank you, Katie. We're looking forward to your presentation.
Hey, Alex, can you hear me? I just want to make sure you can hear me in the room. I think somebody said you can hear me, so.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Thank you for the introduction. I am Katie Schmidt with Ohnstad Twichell. And like was said, I'm going to talk about HR practices today for water resource districts, and I apologize that I'm not there in person today. I am in snowy West Fargo. So as was stated a little bit about me, I work at Ohnstad Twichell. I've been with Ohnstad Twichell for the last 10 years. I am currently a shareholder. I work in the areas municipal law, water law, public finance, and employment law. Prior to joining OT, I was a state and federal judicial clerk, so I worked with a handful of judges at various levels. I am licensed in both North Dakota and Minnesota. Of course, because I'm an attorney, you're going to see one of these. Just a disclaimer, on the information that I'm going to share today is general HR information. It's not applicable to any specific situation, but if you have questions, please let me know. My contact information is on the last screen. So HR is a broad topic, but today we're going to talk about three principal areas, those being hiring, investigating employee complaints, and firing. So first, let's talk about hiring, where your employment relationship begins. So when you're looking to hire some new staff, there are some goals to keep in mind. First, with applications, you want to make sure that you are receiving applications from the most qualified applicants. We're going to talk about job descriptions, what goes into those, the essential functions of each of the positions. And so it's really important to have those things out there to make sure that you get the most qualified applicants applying for your position. Goal, obviously, retention. You want to make sure that you are retaining the most qualified applicant for the position that you have. and making sure that that applicant has the skills and the characteristics needed to complete the job functions that you need them to. The next one, the big one, right? EEO, making sure that you're applying with equal employment opportunity requirements, making sure you have all of your ducks in a row when you're hiring, and then legal compliance. We want to make sure that you stay out of legal trouble as you navigate your way through recruitment and retaining someone. General rules for hiring, you're going to hear me say the words objectivity and consistency numerous times throughout my presentation. Those are really the takeaways that you're going to hear from me today. When it comes to hiring, you want to make sure that you're fair and you're objective, and you want to make sure that you're applying consistency. Your ultimate goal is going to be assessing each applicant's potential to perform the essential functions of the job. Like I said, we're going to talk about that job description and how each of these play into that. So that's really your ultimate goal when it comes to hiring. Your focus is to make sure that each of the candidates has the potential and the actual ability to perform each of those specific job functions. This comes into play later when they're on the job and they're performing, and then if questions arise about misconduct or if their lack of ability to perform the job, you want to make sure that you're assessing those skills. Careful questions to ask. You want to make sure that you're only asking those need to know questions. We're going to talk more about questions specifically and the types of questions that you set up to ask. You want to make sure that those questions are going to measure the person's knowledge, skills, and ability to perform your particular job function. Something to note when we talk more about discrimination, your organization could be liable for discrimination regardless of whether the information was solicited during your interview process or whether or not it was volunteered. So we'll talk about ways to approach those. The big thing that comes into play, and which initially starts with hiring, are protected classes. It's really important to recognize these at the outset because these sort of things will guide how your whole process comes into play. So I'm sure you've heard of a number of these federal laws. Civil rights law, Title VII, deals with a lot of these: race, color, national origin, sex, sexual orientation, religion. The Age Discrimination and Employment Act protects people who are 40 and older. Disability is protected against the Age Discrimination Act. Genetic information is protected, as well as past, current, prospective military service. Other federal laws to keep in mind when you start looking to hire someone: Immigration Reform and Control Act, National Labor Relations Act, Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, Consumer Credit Protection Act, the Bankruptcy Act, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and the Equal Pay Act. These all have different provisions that go into them, which may or may not come into play as you work through this process. But it's just important to be mindful of them. And really, when you're interviewing, when you're asking different questions, to make sure that you're really using your job description as your roadmap and to try and avoid all of these other issues. So the state also has protected categories. It's found in Chapter 4002.4 of the Century Code, and this is the North Dakota Human Rights Act. So this includes a lot of the same things that are protected under federal law, but it also has a couple of extra. So you'll see the ones that are repeats from the federal law: race, color, national origin, religion, sex, sexual orientation, age 40 and older, so it's the same age under federal and state law. Disability is also protected under state law. The other ones that you'll see in these categories that are protected in North Dakota: marital status. So you can't discriminate against someone based on their marital status. You cannot discriminate against someone if they receive public assistance. And you also cannot discriminate against them for engaging in lawful off-duty conduct. Something else to be mindful when you're going through and you are soliciting applications is that in North Dakota, we have a veterans preference. And this is found in Chapter 3719.1. It applies in North Dakota to the state as well as to political subdivisions. It generally gives preference to veterans or qualified veteran spouses in the recruitment and the selection process. So if your organization employs a non-competitive personnel system, which generally means that you are not using a number-based system to assign points to applicants when they come in, it's more of an open system. If you're using that, if you have a veteran that comes in and they are qualified, they meet those essential they can perform those essential job functions, then they have to be hired. If you have both a veteran and a disabled veteran that have applied for this preference, Disabled veterans are given a superior preference over a veteran. If your organization uses a competitive personnel system, which is where you're using a point system that you assign to applicants, if you have a veteran or a disabled veteran, they are assigned additional points or additional percentage if you don't go out of 100. So they're given a preference in the process. In order to qualify for the veteran's preference, you must be a veteran as defined by statute. And that means that you served at least 180 days or fulfilled your active duty. And then you have to have been honorably discharged or still active. You must be a US citizen and you must submit documentation with your application. So you'll know as an employer that someone is looking to assert this preference because there is a form that they will submit when they apply. If no preference is given to someone, they have the ability to appeal. So job descriptions and job postings, best practices. So like I said, the job posting that you have is very important when it comes down to how this person engages with your organization, what you set up for this person to do, how they are marked against this as they move forward. You always want to make sure that you have an accurate job description for the role that you want a person to fill, making sure that you're including necessary skills as well as bona fide occupational qualifications, which is something that comes from federal law, making sure that you're including the essential functions of the job. What is it that you expect this person to do? Making sure that you have all of those things listed, making sure that you're including attendance and timekeeping policies. If your core hours are 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., make sure that you include that in your job description and that you expect employees to be at your organization or available during those core work hours. Make sure that you're including whether or not it's a remote position, if it's in person, if it's hybrid, making sure you're setting those standards as to someone who's coming into your organization would know whether or not they could perform those responsibilities, whether or not they're an exempt or a non-exempt employee. That deals with the Fair Labor Standards Act and whether or not they will be accumulating overtime after they reach a certain percentage of hours in the week. This, like I said, comes back to being best evidence. If someone comes back later and says, hey, you discriminated against me because of X, Y, and Z, you can go back to your job posting and say, no, actually, one of the essential functions of our job is this, and you didn't have any experience in it. So it gives you the ability to put together the best defense that you have going forward, knowing that if this person cannot perform these functions, then they cannot perform your job. That's why I have equal opportunity employer listed on the bottom of that slide. Just knowing if someone comes back later and says, I was discriminated against, you can use this job description and your job posting to your advantage. Other things about job postings and descriptions, you need to avoid gender specific terms when you post something. If you do, right, you can make an argument that someone was discriminated against based on their gender. So using terms versus waiter or waitress as opposed to wait staff, chairman versus chairperson, right, making sure that it's open. You also want to make sure that you avoid expressing a preference in violation of those protected characteristics. So you can imagine young and energetic, recent college graduates, someone may use that to their benefit in an age discrimination claim. Or if you post required to drive between sites versus required to travel between sites, may elicit some sort of discrimination based upon disability. Other things to think about after you've received the applications is how to pick interviews, right? Only select those qualified applicants for the interviews. I have listed first, avoid that North Dakota nice, right? We don't want everyone who applies to have an interview if that person doesn't have the skills to perform the essential functions of the job. If you're interviewing more people than you need to be, it really can just open the door for those sort of claims that come in. You also need to be aware of the disparate impact of AI. We know that AI is gaining speed, right? And so some people will use AI as a tool to ferret through. If they get a number of applications, they'll submit applications into AI to start pulling out potential interview candidates. The problem with it that they found is that AI learns from you. And so if you have put, different things in your search engines, they will pull from those, and it may end up being they get all those young and energetic, right, as opposed to people across a wide swath of ages. So you just need to be mindful if you're using AI to go through applications that you are aware of what's coming out of it and making sure that, oh my gosh, are we discriminating against one group of people as opposed to another, just based upon the results that AI is kicking out. Also, exercise caution with social media or other sites that reveal that protected information. Like I said, in North Dakota, we can't discriminate against lawful off-duty conduct. So if you're going onto someone's social media or their Twitter page before you're interviewing them and you're looking at their pictures, that may be a means that you're discriminating against them if you don't offer them an interview based upon what you see there. So exercise caution in looking at any of those things. You might want to consider narrowing the pool with telephone screening interviews. Having a set list of questions to ask someone may narrow your pool right off the bat. Make sure that you're documenting why candidates were selected or rejected for interviews. You want to make sure that you have that documentation written, signed, dated, and in your file, so that if someone comes back later and says, hey, I wasn't selected and you discriminated against me for this reason, you can say, no, pull out your documentation and say, these are the reasons why we didn't give you an interview. Also, things to think about when you're preparing for these interviews: be aware of the job description and those essential functions. You want to make sure that you're asking questions that pertain to those items. Be familiar with the candidate's application, their resume, other submissions that they've made. Like I said, the veteran's preference could be one. Make sure that you ask open-ended questions that are specific to the job description and necessary qualifications. You want to try and limit it so you don't invite those other protected class sort of questions or answers to come into play. You should ask your candidates the same questions or types of questions. I know when we interview someone from our office, our HR manager has a set list of 8 or 10 questions that she starts off every interview with. So we make sure that we are consistent in that regard, and we have the answers written right on the page, and those are all kept, they're all documented. So we know that if someone came back later and asked some sort of question, we'd have that documentation available to us. Something to think about, like I said, would be asking questions. What sort of questions are you going to ask during the interview? What's the best approach to this? You need to be mindful of those protected classes. The first question I have on here, if you're asking something directly related to it, that would be off limits. I see that you're pregnant. Tell me about your pregnancy. We don't want to ask those sort of questions. Those that elicit information about a protected characteristic. Are you responsible for school drop-off, right? That could be marital status. So someone could come back and bring a discrimination claim based upon that. Also be mindful if the interviewee asks you questions that reveal protected information. Someone asks you, how old are the front desk staff? Those sort of questions we want to move along from, try and sidestep them as much as we can. We don't want to engage in their type of discrimination. It may elicit other sort of information that they may try and use against you later. All right, other sorts of questions to consider as you move through this, just based upon each of the protected categories. So first, race, color, national origin. Consider asking a question, right? If you're wondering about language, don't ask, is English your first language? Consider asking whether the applicant can speak foreign languages if that's an ability that's required for the job. Again, going back to your job description. Religion, a question that wouldn't be allowed. Do you go to church on Saturdays or Sundays? Instead, you could ask the question, can you work weekends? That goes back to, core business hours. Is the person available? Can they be available? So tailoring your question to that sort of that question, that sort of realm, will put you in less hot water than the first question. Things to ask about sexual orientation, sex, marital status, not all. Do you have children? When do you plan to start a family? As opposed to, can you work overtime on little notice? Age, another one, not allowed. When did you graduate? Versus, can you provide us with transcripts? Disability type questions. Instead of asking, are you in good health? Asking the applicant about attendance requirements, making sure that they can be there during those core business hours. asking them about, can they stand for 2 hours? Can they lift 50 pounds? Making sure that they can engage in those essential job functions, as opposed to asking them, do you have a disability, right? Opening the door for that. We want to make sure that we just tie it back to your job description and everything that's included in there. These are some other types of questions that we wouldn't want you to ask during a job interview. Will you miss work for military service? Are you comfortable working in an all male, female environment? Will your husband work if we transfer you? Who lives with you? When do you plan to retire? How old are your children? Are you American? Are you Jewish? What are your plans for Christmas? Right? Some of these can just seem so innocuous, right? And like I said, North Dakota Nice, I think these are things, the small talk that we make in these sort of settings, but we really have to be mindful about what we're saying, just because it could invite some sort of discrimination claim. Another thing to take note of is if you're going to engage in doing pre-hiring screenings. So most of the time, employers will conduct background checks on applicants that come in right before they're hired. So one thing to keep in mind is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Background checks fall within the category of consumer reports, right? So creditworthiness, credit capacity, character, general reputation, personal characteristics, or mode of living. If you plan to engage in conducting background checks, make sure that you disclose this to the applicant that you're going to conduct a background check. Make sure that that form that you give to them is simple and easy to understand. It doesn't need to be convoluted. It doesn't need to include a bunch of legalese. You just want to make it really straightforward. And you have to receive authorization from applicants if you want to conduct one of these sort of screenings. So you need them to sign it. And that, again, make it simple, easy to understand. We don't need to try and confuse anyone. We just want to be straight to the point. Notify that applicant of the results once you get it. Provide them a copy and allow them time to review. If there's something in the report that makes you not hire them, make sure that you notify them of the decision not to report, and make sure that you base it, or the not to hire, and make sure that you include reference to the report and what it is in the report that made you not hire them for the position. This, again, is just more documentation for you to use if that person was to bring a claim later. Okay, so let's say you get to the point, you've interviewed everyone, and you know who you want to hire. Make sure that you record the reasons for hiring the candidate. Make sure that you record the reasons for not hiring the other ones. You want to have this in writing, you want to have it signed, you want to have it dated. Make sure that you have all of that together. You may need this later to defend your reasons for hiring this person or not hiring someone else. Paper your file. That is so important. Other things just to note, once you hire someone, a kind of a checklist for legal hires, conditions, job applications, make sure they're signing it. The other big one on this sheet you'll see is employee handbook and acknowledgement. Having the policies out there so that your employees know to follow them, and then having them sign an acknowledgement form, sign and date, and putting it in their file so that they can't come back later and say, well, I didn't know that was a policy. You have a defensible position if you can pull out that piece of paper and say, nope, I did. You acknowledged, you sign it, and here it is. Another thing to keep in mind when you talk about handbooks and that acknowledgement is types of employment. So in the government realm, there's really 3 different types of employment. The first one is the default, which I'm sure you've heard of, is at-will employment. And that's the default under Chapter 34 of the Century Code. At-will employment means that someone can be terminated by the employer, or the employee can quit their job for any reason at all, no reason, any reason. They can do it either way. They just have to notify the other party. The thing about at-will employment and handbooks is to be mindful of is that sometimes you can include policy provisions in your handbook that change this status from at-will to something that requires cause in order for termination. So you really want to be mindful about what you're including in your handbooks. Oftentimes there's a disclaimer on one of the first couple pages of handbooks that say the employee acknowledges that this handbook does not change their employment status to anything other than at will, and then they sign it. So that's really something important to have. Excuse me. Another type of employment that can change your employment is having a contract or an agreement. This may change at will status which really could be requiring cause for termination. So you wouldn't just be able to require that, or excuse me, terminate that person for any reason at all. But it doesn't necessarily have to change that status. You know, we've drafted employment agreements that specifically have provisions in them that says that it maintains the at-will status, and then we have the person sign an initial next to that paragraph so that they know that they're still an at-will employee. The third type of employment that really comes into play with governmental entities is the civil service system. This is found in the federal government, and cities in North Dakota have the ability to opt into this system. It requires cause for termination, and it allows appeals if there's discipline or termination. Water resource districts do not have civil service in North Dakota. So now that you're through hiring, you have your person, you're all set. Let's say that something comes up and there's some sort of complaint. What do you do? So here's an overview of the process. If you get a complaint, make sure that you assess it and that you document it. You determine if interim remedial action is necessary. Choose the investigator, plan the investigation, conduct interviews, document interviews, complete the investigation, and take action. We're going to talk about each one of these in turn throughout the presentation. Your objectives in an investigation, your primary objective, of course, is to determine what happened. Did someone violate a policy? Is someone being harassed? What's going on in your environment? So that's number one. The second objective is making sure that you as the employer have a defense in litigation. If someone brings a lawsuit for harassment, discrimination, courts are going to be looking to see what you did as an employer to stop that behavior from reoccurring. Caution, of course, in the public sector, we unfortunately have some considerations that we need to make that apply to us that do not apply to the public sector, or excuse me, the private sector. So even before you get a complaint, there are some things that you should be thinking about just as an employer. We need to make sure that you aren't put into a position where your employees are distrusting this process. If employees aren't going to come forward and make complaints, you can't do anything as an employer to try and shield yourself from future conduct. So we want to make sure that we are engaging in a process and creating an environment where employees come forward with their complaints, and then we work through the investigative process in order to protect ourselves from liability. Some of the reasons why employees distrust the process: HR is not reachable or is faceless. I know in a handful of the water resource districts we work with, there is no HR manager, right? It's a secretary, maybe a treasurer, maybe another office employee, maybe a director, and then the board, right? There's not a separate HR director. So making sure that we have some sort of process in place is important. Managers or supervisors are not approachable. Management tells a complaining employee to work it out with a problem employee because we're just not sure what to do. An investigator is too close to the alleged wrongdoer. We see that a lot, right, in smaller organizations where we may need to consider an external one, and we're going to talk about that, an external investigator. In the past, nothing has been done, or the complaining employee suffers retaliation. Employees believe the conclusion is already predetermined, and the investigation turns into a witch hunt of the complaining party. So these are certainly things that we want to dispel before we ever get a complaint. One of the most important things about the complaint process is training your managers, your supervisors, everyone on staff, what needs to happen for an investigation, when it's necessary, what their role is, when they need to involve an HR professional, when they need to involve an employment law attorney. They need to receive and recognize the complaints, right? It doesn't have to be, I have a complaint because this person was sexually harassing me, XYZ. It can be more of a timid, offhanded comment that they're making to a supervisor, enough where the supervisor's ears should be perking up and they should be doing something about it. Making sure that you have a system in place so that you can move through the investigative process promptly and orderly is really important. A lot of times these are in your handbook policies, making sure that employees know the process, right? This goes back to that objectivity and consistency. So here's the clear and effective complaint process, making sure that it's accessible to all of your employees. Make sure they know who to go to, when they need to go to that person, how this works. Assure them that there's no retaliation for making a good faith complaint or for providing information during an investigation. Whenever it's possible, provide for more than one member of management to who a complaint can be raised to. That person might not be comfortable with person A, so they want to have a different person that they can go to. So if possible, having a couple people that they can report to is really desirable. So step one, what happens when you get the complaint, right? Things to keep in mind, complaints are normal. These happen, right? Policy violations, those sort of things, these sort of complaints come up. It's really important how, as an employer, how you handle those complaints, right? For a number of reasons. First, to promote a positive workforce. You want your employees to know that you are going to respond. If someone makes a complaint, you know that you are going to follow the process that you've set forth in the policy manual. Everybody knows what's going to happen. Retaining good employees, right? Knowing if those employees know that this is going to happen and that they're going to be protected by you as an employer, they'll stay. Maintaining positive relationships with your community and your stakeholders, and ensuring that you have that legal compliance, doing what you can do to prevent those sort of instances from happening again. So if you get a complaint from someone, make sure that you're thanking the complainant for raising the issue. You inform the complainant that the complaint will be forwarded to the appropriate person, HR if you have that, and then do so. Make sure that you follow through and you forward it to that person. Assure them that there will be no retaliation, and provide a mechanism and a person to whom the complainant may report retaliation. So if someone is retaliating against them, they know who they're supposed to go to let them know that. Do not promise complete confidentiality or make any other commitments. You'll see throughout the rest of the presentation, these sort of things are open records. And so this sort of information will be coming out. Do you investigate every complaint? The answer is a resounding yes. What extent you investigate it is going to depend upon the situation, right? It could be as simple as you sit down and you chat with a couple people and it's done. It may be far more complex with that, and you need to engage an external investigator and go through a longer process. But at the end of the day, you still investigate them. Employers must conduct them, and they want to make sure that they are aware of potentially wrongful conduct. Even, like I said, even if there's no formal complaint, recognizing when someone is bringing that forward. Don't delay starting the investigation. Make sure that you're moving as swiftly as possible. There may be some sort of resources, emails, video that are existing now that show what's happening. Longer you delay, then it hangs out there. The longer you delay, it may look poorly if someone brings a claim later and you are being asked to be liable for this because you didn't act promptly and move forward with an investigation to stop the behavior. Something to caution you about, you have an obligation as an employer to respond to a complaint, even if the complainant asks you not to do so. So someone may come to their supervisor and say, oh, this just happened, but I just wanted to let you know I don't want you to do anything. It doesn't matter. As the employer, you still have to investigate it because, like I've said, you are there to protect yourself and you want to make sure it doesn't happen again. So when the complaint comes in, it's important to assess what sort of complaint it is, right? It could be any sort of numbers of things: sexual harassment, discrimination, embezzlement, employee theft, misuse of technology, social media, or other property, workplace violations, rules, policy violations, or others. When it comes in, and you're able to assess what type of complaint it is, you may have to get different people involved, right? We're going to talk more about some of the rights when it comes to like embezzlement and theft that alleged employees have in that regard. So you may need to engage the police department as soon as possible. So when these come in, you're going to have to be making those sort of considerations. Other things to think about: what policies are involved? Is this just a policy violation? Is it bigger than that? Like I said, do the police need to be involved? Who does the complaint involve? Why am I the one receiving the complaint? What am I supposed to do? Follow the policy and procedures, initiate an investigation. You'll see when we're talking about who does the complaint involve, that may play into who you select as your investigator. So the purpose of your assessment protects the process, which ultimately will protect you as an employer, right? Gives you the ability to support and defend if someone brings a claim later. The first step in providing proof in that process is documentation. So it's making sure that you're writing down the complaint, writing down what you're doing, having the process outlined so that people know what to do if this comes up. So step 2 in the investigative process, do you have to take some sort of interim remedial action? These are things to think about, whether or not it would be necessary. Are there safety implications, right? Is this person violent in the workplace? Do they need to be separated from the other person? What needs to happen there? Is it a workplace violation? Is it someone is violating a policy and we need to make sure that they don't go into this system because they've made some changes when they shouldn't have, and so we need to lock them out of the system? Is it something we need to do there? Is this person making intolerable working conditions for something else? Criminal implications, like I said, does the police department need to be involved? Examples of remedial action that you may take: putting the complainant on paid leave, excuse me, but making sure that you're not retaliating against them. That's why it would be paid as opposed to unpaid. Does the accused person need to go on paid or unpaid leave while you're completing the investigation? Does that person need to work at a separate job location? Can you temporarily transfer them to a different position? Is there a remote option that you could engage for that person while you're conducting your investigation? Step 3, choosing your investigator. So some of the initial considerations that you make when you're choosing your investigator: that person must be able to investigate fairly and be objective, neutral, and comfortable with the investigative process. They must be familiar with policies and applicable law, must be trained in basic investigative techniques, and they have to be open-minded and a good listener. They're going to be fact-finding throughout this process, making sure that they're gathering whatever they can, asking open-ended questions. So we need to make sure that they're a good listener and they're picking up on everything that they need to pick up on. So one thing I've talked about a little bit is selecting an internal investigator as opposed to an external investigator. So some of the things that you need to consider when you're making that determination: who's the complaint about, right? Is this person making a complaint about an employee who's on the same level that they are, or are they making a complaint about a supervisor, right? If you are on the same level as the supervisor, maybe you shouldn't be the person who's doing the investigation of the person. What are the office dynamics, biases? Is it, oh, that's just Joe, he always does that, right? So then it may be more important to have an external investigator, someone who doesn't know the players who are involved. What's the risk of liability? Is this something small, right? Is it a small policy violation as opposed to something much larger, right? Where there could be a large civil damages that come out of it. If it's larger, it may be more appropriate to use an external investigator. Supervisors rarely make good investigators, and that's because they're so close to the process. If these are your employees that you are supervising, you're going in with those office dynamics, those biases, and so they rarely make good investigators. An outside investigator may be necessary, especially when internal candidates do not have the needed skills and experience. Hopefully complaints don't come up in your organization very often. And like I said, you may not have an HR person. And so you may not want to be the person who takes on investigating complaints. And so it may just be worthwhile to hire an outside investigator. If issues are complex, might be another reason to hire an external one, or the alleged wrongdoers near the top of the organization, right? Let's say that they're at the top and the person who would be investigating them is underneath of them in the hierarchy. Probably want to hire somebody external to do that investigation. One important thing to note: make sure that your investigator's fee is not dependent upon the results. Objectivity is going to be very key. Another thing to think about: should you just use your attorney, right? If you do, that person may become a fact witness if there's some sort of claim that's brought subsequent to the action that's taken against this person. So you wouldn't be able to the attorney wouldn't be able to represent the district in the lawsuit. Information that's provided may not be protected by the attorney-client privilege. Like I said, there's open records that are involved. Using an attorney may be too intimidating for witnesses, right? We all know that nobody likes attorneys. And so if you're sending us into an employment complaint setting, people may not want to talk to us. That may be too intimidating for them. One thing that's important to note, at least with water resource districts, a lot of you use NDRF for your coverage. So if I was your attorney and I was part of the investigation with you, I at least wouldn't have the issues with being a fact witness because NDRF would take over the defense of any sort of complaint that would be raised. So one consideration for that. The next step in the investigative process is to plan the investigation. How are we going to do this? So purpose of the investigation, you want to gather relevant information. You want to make sure you're identifying internal policy implications. Are your policies implicated in whatever this complaint is, or is this really more of a legal issue? So you want to make sure you identify the legal implications if there's anything outside of your policies. You want to support the decision-making process, and you want to support responses to an agency administrative hearing or a lawsuit if something gets raised. Your end goals, like I said, this goes back to having those pre-investigation considerations and making sure that people trust the process. The end goals, you want to show employees, your board, your community, et cetera, that you take policies and complaints seriously, right? You want to encourage employees to follow the policies. You want to encourage reporting of misconduct. We can't do anything as an employer unless we know what's going on. You want to reduce that employer liability. You want to remedy misconduct that's happening within your organization, and you want to improve the workplace, making sure that these sort of issues aren't occurring. So make sure that you go into every investigation with an open mind and a sense of fairness to all the parties involved. Like I said, the investigator is going in to do a fact-finding mission and to just gather the information that that person needs to make a determination at the end. A sense of promptness, making sure that you're moving swiftly, expectation of thoroughness, and an understanding of the proper documentation that you need to have. So when you start planning whether you're going to do when you're going to do an investigation, you want to make sure that you're reviewing applicable policies, rules, laws. Know which policy that they are accused of violating. Make sure that you know that, forward and backward, you know all of that. You know if this is a discrimination claim, you know what qualifies as sexual discrimination. You know what workplace harassment is going into it. Do identify the issues to be investigated, right? If you have, we've had people come to us and say, oh, we have all of this broad swath of issues. Like, okay, let's narrow it down. We have to do one thing at a time because we just can't do all of this at once. We need to make sure we have specific incidents that we are investigating. Collecting and preserving documentation. Identifying witnesses to interview in order. If you think about which order you're going to interview them in, identifying how your interviews will be conducted, where, like that's more of the logistics of where, when. Do prepare a checklist and a timeline. Be flexible. Like if you're having a conversation with someone and new facts come up, new circumstances, maybe there's another instance that this occurred, make sure that you're flexible enough in your interview schedule to make note of those things and come back to them if you need to. So step 5, conducting interviews. So generally your interviewees are going to be the complainants, which may not be the same as the alleged victim, or it could be. Complainant could be the person who sits next to the victim and they want to come forward because the victim is scared to. So usually it's complainants, alleged victim, alleged wrongdoer, and other witnesses with relevant firsthand knowledge. I'm sure that everyone has experienced how the game of telephone works. And if someone has something to say and then they pass it along, they pass it along, they pass it along, it's really not helpful for an investigation. If you have someone who did not see the incident, maybe wasn't even at work, and they're trying to come forward and tell you what happened, you want to make sure that your witnesses have relevant firsthand knowledge. Otherwise, your investigation will span much longer than it needs to, and you'll get a lot of information that may not be trustworthy. Thinking about logistics when you're conducting your interviews, where are you going to have them? Are you going to do it in your office? Or are you going to do it off site? Are you going to do it in a glass framed conference room where everyone's going to see, people are going to talk? So things to think about: when to do it, who would have present during the interview, caution about electronic recording. Some entities have bylaws that will require electronic recording, so it's helpful to make sure that you look at those beforehand to know whether or not that is a requirement. that you have of your interviews. Some of them don't. It's up to you whether or not you really want to employ electronic recording. Like I've said, it'll be an open record if it is. So it may be something to caution against. A couple of things. This is one of the instances where public employers have a couple of other things to take notice of as compared to private employers. The first one is Wayne Garden rights. That has to do with employees who are represented by a union. They have the right to request and have a union representative present at the investigatory interview if the employee believes there may be disciplinary action taken against them. So it's important to note which of your employees, if any, are part of a union. Another thing to note is Garrity warnings. Garrity was a U.S. Supreme Court case that requires governmental employees be given notice if they're going to cooperate in an investigative interview under the threat of disciplinary action. The Supreme Court said that someone cannot be forced to choose between their job and a criminal investigation. And so if they sign the Garrity rights, the things that come out in their investigative interview cannot be used in a criminal setting. So this is really important if you have someone who is accused of engaging in illegal behavior, like I said, to have the police department involved. You may want them to be who is interviewing this employee as opposed to you. So common to all interviews, you want to make sure that you open them with a short statement, thank the person and explain to them why they're being interviewed, offer a brief explanation of the process, ask the interviewee to be truthful, assure them that there will be no retaliation to them for taking part in the interview. Do not assure complete confidentiality like we talked about, and make sure that you explain any sort of follow-up that the person, if they have some sort of follow-up responses, or if they have documentation or videos or anything like that that they want to turn over to you, that they know what to do with that. So just as investigator, investigator demeanor and approach, make sure that you're professional, make sure that you're patient, understanding, and tactful, that you're taking the allegations seriously, you're asking open-ended questions. You want the interviewee to tell their story. You want to sit back and let them give all of this information, and then you can go back and you can pull out different instances and you can really dig into the specifics. Don't rush them. Don't go in with predetermined outcomes. You're just fact-finding. Discuss one incident at a time, try and isolate them. And so then you can get the most information that you can factually about each one of those. Making sure that you're listening carefully. You're getting the interviewee's story. Another important thing to note is body language and nonverbal cues. You may notice that when you talk about one subject, the interviewee constantly crosses their arms or switches the leg, right? Switches cross legs or something. You may be getting those nonverbal cues. So it's really important to take note of those things. Be mindful of your own body language and facial expressions, right? Make sure that you're going in with a poker face. Make sure that if they give you some sort of information that you're not having a facial reaction to it, because that may sway what they tell you, what they don't tell you, what their story is. Take notes if desired. Read your notes back to confirm accuracy and fill in the gaps with your witness. Invite the interviewee to provide further information via email or other communication. So best practices, explaining the process, the retaliation issues, the confidentiality issues. Don't rush the interviews. Make sure you're courteous to all the interviewees, including the alleged wrongdoer. Treat everybody the same. Again, consistency, objective. Ask for corroborating evidence or more details. They may have emails, right? They may have taken a cell phone video. There may be more things that they can give to you. Re-interview them if necessary. Like I said, be flexible if something comes up. If you're interviewing someone else and you take notes and you need to go back and re-interview this person, go back and re-interview them. Don't ask leading questions. Let them tell you their story. Don't answer questions regarding the substance of the investigation, and don't communicate your legal conclusions. They'll want to know where you are, what you've heard, what sort of conclusions you've derived so far. Don't engage in it. Gather all the relevant documents, personnel records, emails, prior complaints, notes, videos, audio tapes. So when you get to the complainant/alleged victim, this is usually the person who's interviewed first. You have them fill out a pre-interview acknowledgement form. This generally covers that the interview is voluntary and that they know that there won't be retaliation against them for engaging, and also that they know that they need to be truthful. The type of questions that you're going to ask again are going to be open-ended, non-leading. What happened? When did it happen? Is it ongoing? How often did it happen? Where did it happen? What specifically was said or discussed? Who was involved or present? Anyone else with relevant information? Witnesses? What was your involvement? Doing what you can to get their story, plus if anybody else was involved. More questions you can ask. How did you react or respond? Did you object to the conduct? How did it affect you? Was it discussed with anyone else, right? You can get those other witnesses, previous complaints, relevant documents. Did you have a relationship with the alleged wrongdoer? How might the alleged wrongdoer respond to the complaint? Are there any other issues? What does the complainant want done? You can certainly ask what they want done, but again, don't promise them that that's what will be happening. Your closing statements, ask them if there's anything else the investigator needs to know. Be mindful of the fact that retaliation is prohibited and that that person should report. Again, give them follow-up information as to who they should report that to. Like I said, don't indicate or promise any sort of action that's going to come out of the investigation. Again, you're just fact-finding at this stage. So witnesses are usually the next batch of people that you would interview. They again sign that pre-interview acknowledgement form. Largely the same questions, making sure that you're seeking that truthful account, that firsthand knowledge from them. Don't disclose any sort of information. Like I said, these people may be looking for conclusions you've drawn, the information that other people have disclosed already. Don't disclose it, just gather what their information is, ask for their versions of the facts, collect dates, times, locations, whether they know if there are any other witnesses to the incident, ask if there's knowledge of other incidents involving the alleged wrongdoer. Again, no retaliation, no promises of action or inaction. When you get to the alleged wrongdoer, it's largely the same, right? They have their pre-investigative forms. Who should be present? That's one thing that you want to think about when you're conducting these interviews. Remember the Weingarten, you may have to have someone from a union representation there, and the Garrity warnings. Make sure that you provide a brief general overview of the complaint, provide the overview of the investigative process, assure the person that you are just fact-finding. There's no prejudgments made about the validity of the complaint. If you have an alleged wrongdoer who says, I don't want to participate, I don't want to be interviewed, my response to them is generally, well, then you don't get to tell your side of the story, right? As the interviewer, you're just doing the fact collecting. And if this person isn't willing to engage and present their side of the facts, then you don't have their facts. Questions to ask the alleged wrongdoer, response to the alleged facts, date, time, location, witnesses, about any relationship they'd had with the complaining party or the alleged victim. What did the accused do or say with respect to each incident? Again, it's important to isolate each of those incidents to talk through them. Whether the wrongdoer believed the conduct was appropriate. What did the alleged wrongdoer mean or intend by the actions? If they deny it, why might the complaining party or the alleged victim lie? Be aware of their demeanor, right? Those nonverbal cues, their body language. When you ask those sort of questions, they can be very telling. Closing statements when you're discussing with the alleged wrongdoer. Anything else that they want to tell the investigator, any reason that they were not able to fully answer your questions. Make sure that they know that retaliation is prohibited, could lead to discipline, must be reported. Again, don't indicate or promise what the outcome of the investigation is going to be. So once you've completed all of the interviews, step 6 is documenting interviews. If you're taking notes during your interviews, stick to the fact, right? I had a case once where someone in the notes wrote WTH exclamation point. That is not helpful as an interviewer if you're making those sort of comments in the sidebars. Your credibility definitely gets questioned later when that comes out. Like I said, they're open records, they're disclosable. Set forth objective basis for your conclusions regarding credibility. Again, noting the body language, the nonverbal cues. Review your notes. You may want another person to take notes during your interview. It's entirely a personal preference. If you have someone else in there, then you're focused on asking questions as opposed to writing notes. More documentation. You may get witness statements. That may be something that you want to collect. They can serve to limit what was actually said during the interviews, and they can be helpful in future litigation because that person has signed it and dated it and given it to you. They can review and correct those errors that may be part of it. Make sure, like I said before, that these are discoverable. They're subject to open records laws. The city of Minot got caught in a lawsuit a little while ago where they were trying to not disclose notes from an investigation and they had to turn them over. So please note they are discoverable and subject to open records. So after you have completed everything, what do you do with it? Completing the investigation. So you want to make sure that you're going to compile a record for whoever the person is that's making the decision about discipline and what's going to be the outcome of the complaint. Make sure that you're compiling the complaint, any written responses or statements that you've received from witnesses, and then any of the other sort of information that corroborates a story. Emails, other written documentation, video surveillance, recordings, anything else that you have there. Make sure, as the person who is taking this all in, that you have, again, reviewed internal policies, rules, standards. Someone may come forward and the complaint may be that they violated policy X, when after you go through all of this, oh my goodness, now they violated policy X, Y, Z. But you know that you're aware of them and you can put that into your report. Make sure that you're also aware of federal, state, and local laws, rules, and regulations. So this is the time when you assess the information that you've taken in, right? One of the big ones to do is credibility determinations. Did the person have a motive to lie? Was the individual forthcoming? Is there evidence to corroborate a person's story? How did the alleged wrongdoer react to the allegations? What is the person's history? You're going to take all of these and probably more into consideration when you're deciding who is being truthful and what comes forward out of your interviews. So your job as the investigator is to conclude what happened and the circumstances surrounding it. You're going to apply applicable policies and laws to the facts that you've identified through all of your interviews. You're going to recommend action or discipline, and you need to make sure that they fit the circumstances. You want to be consistent, again, consistent with your policies and your practices, and then you're going to put together your final report. Your final report is going to start with a section that talks about purpose and scope of investigation. And then you're going to summarize what the allegations were, what relevant policies or laws come into play. You're going to generally summarize your witness interviews, and then you're going to summarize other evidence or information reviewed or relied upon when you're making your findings in the report. Next, you'll identify the facts that you've come to, the findings that you've made. You're going to explain why certain interviewees or statements were more credible than others. Why was this person believable? Why was that person not believable? What sort of body language did they exhibit? What nonverbal cues did they exhibit? They say this happened, but these other three people say this happened, right? Putting it all together and then providing an explanation for your credibility determinations. Excuse me. And then at the end, you'll make a conclusion, which is based upon the entire record that you've gathered. So if the investigator is also the decision maker, then you must make a decision on what action to take, if any, right? If there's going to be discipline, then you need to decide, is it going to be verbal? Is it going to be written? I would err on the side of written just to make sure then the person can sign it and date it, and then you'll keep it, right? Is there a complaint, report? Is the discipline going in the personnel file? How are we handling it? Is there a recommendation for discharge, right? Is it time to terminate this person? Give your final investigative report to the complainant and the respondent. Make sure that you give them copies so they know what you've concluded, what you found at the end. Make sure that you caution, right? No retaliation as to what comes out of this. And like I said, your report itself is likely an open record or discoverable once the investigation is complete. The Century Code protects internal investigations for 75 days or until that investigation is finalized. So let's say we get to the point where it's time to terminate, right? This person has made it to that point and it's time for them to exit our organization. So just initially, there's a couple different types of separation. The first, of course, is voluntary resignation, where that person decides they're going to end their employment and they're going to walk away. The second is involuntary terminations. And these can come for a variety of reasons, right? First, organizational change, layoffs, right? Your business is downsizing and there's an organizational change there. Unsatisfactory performance, misconduct. Whenever we have separations, one thing that really comes out of it is the unemployment qualification questions. People always ask, well, is it better if I resign? Does that mean that I get unemployment? And the answer is no, it doesn't, right? In North Dakota, you're very limited when you can receive unemployment, and it usually has to do with there's not some sort of cause. So as an employee, if you decide to look for a different job, no unemployment. As an employee, if you decide to resign because you were given the option because there was some nefarious conduct happening, you don't get unemployment. If your employer terminates you for cause, you don't get unemployment. It's largely limited to the instances where there's like a layoff, some sort of non-cause reason that the company lets you go. So things to think about if you're ready to terminate someone, right? We're back to those protected classes. We've come full circle. Some things to keep in mind is whether or not the person engaged in some recent protected activity. We've seen people where it's like they have a problem employee, and the person is just, still showing up late, still not doing well at their job, and then all of a sudden goes on FMLA. And then they're gone, and the employer's like, well, can I terminate them now? You can, right? Even though they're on FMLA, but the situation becomes more murky. If you would have terminated them prior to the FMLA, there would have been a better reason, right? You may not have had those discriminatory claims, but if you do it while someone is on FMLA, then they may bring a claim for it. And so those are certain things that you need to keep in mind when you're looking to terminate someone. Another thing to keep in mind is prior similar situations. How have you as an employer handled this sort of behavior with other people, right? If you have Jane in accounting who is consistently late, not good at her job, but you've just kind of brushed it over and haven't done anything about it. And then you have Bob in public works, and let's say Bob's late once and you decide you're out, Bob, you're firing him. Bob may bring a claim for discrimination because you haven't handled those situations consistently. Like I said, consistency, objectivity, those are the words of the day today. So being mindful of those things if you're ready to terminate someone. Other considerations, like we previously talked about, the types of employment. Is there an employment contract? Is there a certain process that you need to follow? Is there cause? Is there not cause required? Are they still employees at will? Are there disciplinary policies that are set forth in your handbook that you have to follow before you can get to the point of terminating them? Do you have to utilize progressive discipline, right? Does it have to go from a note in the file to the person has to go on a PIP to, whatever it is before they can be terminated? You need to be mindful of those things. Another thing to be mindful in governmental employment, due process, right? As we all know, the 14th Amendment is cannot be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. And courts have found that government employees may have a property interest in their job. So even if an employee is at will, you still need to give them due process, which the Loudermill case said that due process includes letting the person know the reason why they're being terminated, and then giving them the opportunity to respond. And so it's not incredibly involved, but it's still due process that needs to be afforded to the person. Best practice when it comes to these involuntary terminations, again, be objective, be consistent. Make sure that you're documenting everything, right? You're objectively documenting poor performance, misconduct, conversations that you've had with the employee, making sure that you have that documentation on an ongoing basis and not just doing it at the time of termination. It can certainly raise red flags if all of a sudden there's all of this information being drafted right before the person is terminated when it's been happening over a 6-month period as opposed to documenting it over the 6-month period. Certainly raises questions. Things to document: dates, conversations or incidents that you've had with this problem employee, making sure that you document when you made the decision to terminate them. That may come into play, like if you have that FMLA sort of situation where you were going to terminate them the week before and then they went out, but at least you have it documented in your notes. Document conversations you've had with a problem employee. other impacted employees, and then with other supervisors. When it comes to evaluations, the things that you're doing, the number one thing that we recommend against is rubber stamping these. This goes back to that North Dakota NICE, right? Making sure that you're actually giving someone an accurate evaluation of their job performance. Are they able to perform those essential job functions? If they're not, write it down. Make sure that you include it in their evaluation, and make sure that you tell the employee that that's what's happening and that they're signing off on it, they're dating it, making sure that they know what's happening. If they have a disciplinary record, making sure that the violations of their policies and procedures noted, absences, misconduct, how that works. If possible, document how the misconduct impacted the workplace. That includes, if you're issuing written warnings, putting somebody on a PIP, last chance agreements, make sure you have it all written down, because it's going to be your best defense later. Some of the common pitfalls that we see when it comes to termination, like I've talked about, untimely documentation, basics, not having things signed, not having things dated, having it illegible. We can't use it later to defend you if we don't know when it came from or can't read it. Try and avoid using always, never, those sort of terms. They're always late, right? Well, always late may be different than she's late every Monday, right? Monday this day, Monday this day, Monday this day. Making sure that you're being specific about it. Try and avoid being vague. Talk to Tom about his behavior. Again, I don't know what you talked to Tom about, and I can't use it later to defend you. So it's really important to have those specifics included in there as a means to use that documentation to your advantage later. And then having documentation that improperly references those protected class issues, we certainly want to avoid those. So best practices, if you think it's time to terminate, refer to your policies and procedures, double check the process, make sure that you've gone through everything that you need to go through. Consult with HR. If you have a person, leadership, your employment attorney, how that works. You're going to meet with the problem employee. You're going to collect the problem employee's company property, make sure that you keep those things. If you decide that you want to engage in a separation agreement with that person, if it's a consideration that you're making, make sure that you think about consistency and how that will set a precedent going forward for other employees that leave your organization. Make sure that you have a wavelength on how that will go. If you do a separation agreement, make sure that you're including a waiver of all claims. That's required by the Century Code in Chapter 9. If you have an age discrimination claim in there, if they're waiving that, if your employee is 40 or over, once you give them that separation agreement, they have 21 days to review and accept it. And then even after they accept it, they have 7 days to revoke their acceptance. So when you meet with them, make sure you have written notes for what you're going to communicate with the person. Try and anticipate what the person's reaction to the termination is going to be. That'll help you put together a better plan. Time the meeting carefully, right? If this person has access to things in your system, you want to make sure that you know what those are beforehand and that you can cease that access as soon as possible. You don't want to linger with someone over the weekend if they have a laptop or something like that. Hold the discussion in private. Schedule a conference room in advance if necessary, and then consider having another person in the room with you. Definitely an advantage of having someone to back what you said. During the meeting, make sure that you remain calm, that you're clearly stating those reasons for termination, giving the employee an opportunity to respond on those due process rights, making it clear that the employee is terminated and that negotiation is not possible. Make sure you discuss any issues that need to be closed, final pay, benefits. I know some employers just send out like a final letter after the person is terminated, and that includes those dates and COBRA benefits or anything like that that's available. And then make sure that you walk the person out. Try not to engage in any small talk or dance around the point. Try not to rehash underlying issues. Don't make any sort of personal accusations. Make it as straightforward as you can, and then the employer is ready to move on. So that's what I have for you today. Really, the takeaways, you've heard me say them numerous times, are objectivity and consistency when you're approaching these sort of issues. My contact information is on the screen. Please let me know if you have any sort of questions. Does anybody have any questions now? Or you can certainly shoot them to me in an email and I can answer them later, whatever works best.
Are there any questions? If there are, we're going to use the microphone so Katie can hear.
Yeah, Katie, can you ask a candidate for a position if they smoke cigarettes, considering that there would be additional smoke breaks, potential odors, and also increased health insurance premiums?
Sure. That's one of those things that falls into that lawful conduct, right? Off-duty lawful conduct. You'd have to make sure that you could tie it back into somehow into your essential job functions, right? You obviously can't afford them extra breaks, but they'll have breaks under the law that they're afforded. So I would be cautious about asking that sort of question.
Thank you. Any other questions?
No more questions. Then at this time we're going to move into a break, and we are going to be back here at 10:15. And just a reminder that all of these sessions this morning are being recorded, so there's a lot of information there. So they're recorded. They're going to be on the water users website so that you can go back and relook at them if you feel the need to do that. So let's take a break now for a few minutes and be back here.